Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, we're back.
Yes.
And you're up this
back.
week. What are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah. We're back, and I feel like, nothing has changed in the world since we...
Nothing?
Yeah, a lot of things have happened. But we're not talking about those things today because I'm bringing a book called Their Borders, Our World, Building New Solidarities with Palestine. It's an anthology produced by the Palestine Festival of Literature and published by Haymarket Books.
Yes.
There are 10 essays and one poem. I think one poem.
It was one poem.
And artwork throughout. And the book captures a variety of perspectives and experiences of the authors. And most of the book was written prior to October 2023. So there's a few references of life in Palestine, in Gaza after October 2023, but not a lot. A lot of it was written beforehand.
Right.
And Yasmin El Rifai wrote this about the book in the foreword, which I thought sets the context for the book and our conversation about it really, really well.
Yeah.
So they said, this book is not for readers to understand Palestine, although it will impart some knowledge about that place. It is for readers to better understand themselves, their future, and how they might fight for them. So I love that quote because it makes us consider how we're involved in these stories and these experiences of other people. How are we complicit? In what ways have we experienced settler colonialism as a system? And what does solidarity look like for us as individuals or as groups? And another quote from the foreword that I wanted to share is this. When the bombs stop falling, we will hear more about the horrors that Israel has committed. We will also hear about the difficult and inspiring things people are doing to survive. No one should have to be a hero, and it does not lighten the horror of this crime. But this is what humans do. In their struggle for life, who am I to give up? Who are we? Wow. And I don't really have anything to add to that, but to reiterate, who are we to give up and to fight and to push for an arms embargo and a ceasefire in the meantime, all the things. So. What did you think? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, those are some really poignant questions there,
Yeah.
right? Really important questions. I don't think there's anything we could add to those questions, but what really strikes me about the one quote that you read was, no one should have to be a hero. And I feel like in so many ways through a lot of the media we consume here and talking about particularly the real world things that are happening. Yeah. We're seeing people step up in incredible ways and having to be heroes or even martyrs when they didn't sign up to do those things. But this definitely was a great book. There's a lot in this book for us to talk about, a lot of life, a lot of experiences, a lot of reflections shared by the authors of the essays that make up this book. And so, this could be a long episode because this book, there was so much here. But I'll be honest, this was difficult for me to get through.
Yeah, it's
like
challenging.
the content was challenging. The essays themselves I thought were real heady at times, real rich, were heavy too. And I think partially I was finishing up reading this book at the start of a really busy time at work for me, which is why we missed an episode or two. So my mind kind of struggled to get through some of that heavy content. But I am very excited for us. I was excited to finish the book. I'm very excited for us to get the chance to finally talk about, this is our July book, but we're in August. Sorry, folks. One of the many things that I appreciated in the foreword actually was how Yasmin names the fact that Palestine is a laboratory for imperialism. And that concept connects to our first book from this year, the Palestine Laboratory by Anthony Lowenstein, which was all about Israel's weapons and surveillance technologies and how those things have been tested and used on Palestine, making it a laboratory for experimentation and brutality. And so Yasmin says this about Palestine being this laboratory for imperialism. Quote, the need for profit and the need to avoid understanding colonial structures and what they make of the people who run and live in them remain mutually reinforcing. Palestine is a present-day imperialism's laboratory in the last region of the world to be formally colonized and occupied by Western empires. This places it, its subjugation, and its resistance in direct relation to any question of liberation almost anywhere. Our solidarity cannot be made, and it is an act of creation from a position of passive witnessing, and it cannot be bracketed from the rest of life. My solidarity with Palestine must be a practice that is also about me and my life and my future and that of my children. And I don't know, that one stopped me in my track. I thought like that statement is fire, as the kids say, right? But particularly that last part stands out to me and sits at the center of what is important for all of us to take away from this, not only this forward, but this book. And that is this idea of solidarity and how our solidarity is interconnected in literally all of the ways.
Yeah.
And that's the most important thing I think folks who are standing with Palestine are calling for with the ceasefire. And I think what is at the center of, their thoughts, their call for action and why this is so important to them.
Yeah, I think the calls for action and arms embargoes and ceasefires is all based on, well, I won't say all, but
yeah,
it feels connected to me to a lot of other struggles for liberation around the world.
Yeah.
And I think that people see mirror images of this struggle with things that are happening like in the Congo and in other places around the world. What has happened in the United States over the last 400 years
right.
is also directly reflected there. There's so much interconnection in the ways that these systems of settler colonialism work that people see how it's connected. And
right.
so there's a sense of solidarity there
Yeah.
because lots of people have experienced in different ways the surveillance and the brutality and the apartheid systems.
Yes, right?
Israel has put in place there.
Yeah, it's not a leap for folks to understand, the struggles, the settler colonialism, the white supremacy, that whatever the thing is, it might look a little different in how it's executed, but folks can recognize it when they see it.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
One of the other essays, speaking of recognizing things when you see them, this sort of challenges that, and it talks about the ways that we don't recognize it when we see it, and why that happens. It's called Reflections on Structural Gaslighting by Dina Omar.
Yes.
And this was such a sharp piece of analysis of how settler colonialism is working as a form of collective gaslighting of Palestinians and of most of the world.
Right.
So Dina Omar says, quote, "How is gaslighting built into the infrastructure of the Israeli settler colonial project? While the environmental violence and the physical infrastructure of the occupation are well documented, less studied are the indirect epistemic and symbolic violences that normalize colonial violence happening in real time. For example, ever wonder what editorial boards at the New York Times calibrate when characterizing internationally funded settlement projects that routinely dispossess indigenous people as, quote, new neighborhoods? Who decides to see or not see violence, or who has the luxury of not seeing violence?" So this is so poignant. It's such a perfect point to make. And it's similar to a concept we've talked about on the podcast before about what we choose to see as violence or what we choose to see and define as criminal.
Right.
It's subjective, and it's through the lenses of those who are in control. So we believe the police create safety because that's what we've been led to believe. We believe that hiring more officers will lead to more safety. We don't have evidence for that, but we believe it to be true.
Right.
And that drives the decision-making budgetary policies of local governments. We decide that letting people go hungry or live without housing is not violence in some way. And we decide that illegal settlements are just new neighborhoods. And that's how we choose to talk about it in our papers of record around the West.
Yes.
And all of that is, as Dina Omar says, structural gaslighting. It's leading us to believe that we're not seeing the things that we're seeing, or that the things that we're seeing aren't what we think they are,
right,
or aren't what we know them to be,
as
further projects of settler colonialism or as apartheid.
Yeah, that essay, there was really some sharp analysis in that one, and the power of gaslighting was sort of on full display there, and was a big lesson from that piece. So I appreciated that essay too, and the critique in that, the analysis in that, I should say. So that's good stuff. One of the other essays I wanted to chat about, and I figured you would appreciate this one too, is an essay called Renewing Solidarity by Mahdi Sabbagh, who actually edited this book and is a co-curator of PalFest. So one of the many things I highlighted in that essay was his thoughts on inequality, which I think certainly speaks to what we're seeing happening in Palestine, of course, but is also has this broader implication as well. So Mahdi says this, quote, "Inequality, we keep repeating to ourselves, is at an all-time high in virtually every sector of society. Inequality is discussed as a condition to be remedied by policies, by law, by economics, by taxes, by charity, by capital. But those who cannot make ends meet, whose livelihoods and lives are violated, experience inequality not as a bureaucratic operation, but as injustice, as a continuous siege. The pandemic and the government's knee-jerk reactions to it besieged communities already dispossessed by capitalism's extractive properties. This is where relationality steps in as a tactical remedy to this condition. It calls for us to come together." I love that quote. I love the concept there. And as a related aside, there was this great Instagram post recently from the Working Families Party, and I think I posted it in our story because it was an image quote that said, "Inequality is not inevitable; it is a policy choice."
Yeah.
Right. And I think that directly connects to this. I think in a lot of ways, kind of connecting back to this quote, the pandemic, for as horrible as it was, and honestly continues to be, right?
Yeah.
Folks are still getting COVID. There's an uptick in cases, but the pandemic opened a lot of folks' eyes to how inequality is experienced by folks around the world, and the power, but also the power of what happens when we all come together to save each other. In so many ways, the pandemic, forced us to think about how do we take care of one another, our neighbors, our families. We stepped up in big ways to do that, especially given the government's response in some ways to support us.
Response or lack thereof.
And so I think the more we can recognize this and employ relationality, as he calls it here in this essay, to our day-to-day lives, I think the better we'll be, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think relationality helps us think about all the ways that we're connected. It leads to solidarity in a lot of ways too, I think.
Absolutely. And it helps us think about that gaslighting. We can call each other out. We can sort of call things what they are. If we're in relationship and community with one another, we can help each other along the way too.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. There's a lot of connection there.
Yeah. And I think that honestly points to, you remember a long time ago, we talked about the Showing Up for Racial Justice resource toolkit.
Yes.
About how you sort of start to discuss racial justice with people who are resistant to that, right, from the get-go.
Absolutely.
And I think part of it was creating a relationship, having that relationality with them to be able to say, well, we're talking about similar things, or we share these values, and the way that they come out for me is this way.
Yes.
And it's just a way to start to get into that space and bring them into a movement that is welcoming of them, especially once they understand that we're in alignment in a lot of ways that that you've been taught that we're not.
Absolutely. Great connection there.
So speaking of great connections, one of the things that I loved that popped up in this book, not that I love the concept, but I love that I'm seeing it again to talk about it again, is something that we first talked about from As Black as Resistance by Zoe Samudzi and William Anderson.
Yeah.
And that is Necropolitics. So let me share this quotation from the essay Concerning the Violence of Architecture by Mabel O. Wilson. Mabel says, quote, "When bodies cross borders, they are subjected to all forms of scrutiny. Processes of subjugation, nationality, but also gender, sexuality, and race are performed, allowing agents of the state to determine the status of belonging, rights, and humanity. At the various border crossings that I experienced while traveling around the West Bank, scenes of subjugation played out the necropolitical imperative of modern governmentality, which is to make, live, or let die." And I remember really appreciating having the language of necropolitics when we first learned that in As Black as Resistance, because it lays bare the concepts that I just mentioned about calling illegal settlements a new neighborhood, right? It's a different way to talk about the way that gaslighting happens.
Right.
It gives us a way to talk about the choices our governments make on what they fund and who gets to live and live well based on tax policy or education funding or healthcare. We get to have ultra wealthy people and people without housing going hungry because of necropolitics. The inability of the Democrats to codify abortion access when Roe was law is a necropolitical choice at the end of the day.
Yes.
Who gets stopped and frisked by the NYPD or who gets additional scrutiny at an IDF checkpoint? It's all necropolitics. We're subjected to these systems that make many of us disposable for the benefit of the very, very few.
Man, that disposability concept strikes again. Yeah, this chapter, or this essay, I should say, was really great for me, particularly when I saw the reference to As Black as Resistance, because that has hands down is one of my favorite books that we've read for this podcast. And honestly, what stands out to me in all of that, in addition to that great concept of necropolitics, not great, but great, was the notion of humanity in relation to nation states and borders.
Yeah.
And in terms of all of the things you mentioned too, like the government's choices around what they fund and abortion rights and policing in this country. So that was a truly great essay.
Yeah. And it gives us, like we talk about humans moving across borders, it gives us that language to talk about the policy choices and who gets to live and who dies and that hierarchy. But also when you talk about borders and who crosses borders and our humanity crossing borders, we also get that lays bare how borders are a political concept.
Yes.
They're not real
Nope.
in the sense of like, you know, summer is real, winter is real, seasonal change is real, but like borders aren't real in that way.
Right.
We have created a reality around which they have become real. And that's also a necropolitical decision.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it was. I appreciate your point there. It was great to have that language and that understanding as I read through that piece, and that piece was really great, talking about that author's experience traveling and who got stopped and why and all of that good stuff. There was just, again, talking about people's experiences. That was a key takeaway for this book for me. One of the other things I loved that I wanted to bring up was you mentioned there was one poem in this book, and I wanted to bring it. I don't know that we've talked about poems here, or we've shared the poems here. Maybe we have, but I wanted to share it because it was beautiful. It's called Gaza Love Song, and it was written by Jehan Besito, who is a poet and researcher and an aid worker. And I think the version that is featured in this book is adapted from a longer version, but it's still really good. And I don't know, I just loved it, so I wanted to share it. So this is the poem. I go to Erez to remind myself that Gaza is now an angry ball of flames behind the wall. My eyes shut, fingers move on their own to read the sky in Braille. The clouds are pocked with fire balloons. They burn my fingers up. I don't know how many times I died on the way to this place, but never arrived. This. You call to say, even the dead grow old without a homeland. This is. You call to say, we cross the borders with our blood. This is how. The air is full of children's songs. Look up. This is how we set the siege on fire. And so that's the end of it. Again, I think when I looked it up, it was an adaptation from a longer poem, so I would encourage folks to read it. But I just thought with this beautiful poem and like with so much of liberation work and abolition work and so on, you know, that we've read about, and we know the power of art in telling stories and enriching the work and giving folks an outlet. And so it was a nice, I don't remember where it was in the sequence of the book, but I appreciated having that moment of, a shorter piece and a beautiful poem and a really powerful one in the midst of all the other stories that are in this great book.
Yeah, and it was nice to have something that was such an interpretation. It was it was not that the other things aren't art.
Right. Yep.
But it's poetry. There's a different set of metaphors that we're playing with when we're talking about language and we're talking about writing.
Absolutely.
In that context. So yeah, that was such a great poem.
Yeah.
Well, this feels like a good place to shift to talk about application.
Yeah, let's do it.
How does this book and what we've learned from it apply to our everyday lives? I want to talk about another great essay that you mentioned already called Renewing Solidarity by Mahdi Sabbagh. And he talks about how witnessing by itself is in fact futile. Witnessing must be integrated into a practice of solidarity to formulate meaningful change. To witness injustice seeded into the landscape, into the built environment, allows the mind to ask a cascade of questions. How do people experience injustice? Why are they subjugated to injustice? Who designed this injustice? How was it funded? Who benefits from it?
Wow.
And Mahdi Sabbagh goes on to say that, quote, in actively witnessing what oppressive systems do to communities and their environments, we begin to build a tradition of witness, one that makes solidarity not only possible, but inevitable. Yes. And I think those are such great things for us to consider that pushes on the constructs that I mentioned before and helps us overcome gaslighting.
Yeah, yeah.
These questions help us break through the mythology that empires create for us as simple narratives of, good and evil, or in this case, righteous and terrorist.
Yeah.
Maybe is the way that gets set up. So we can start to see the injustices are baked into systems by design. It's no accident that I grew up believing that the police are here for our safety, and that if you work hard, you can accomplish whatever you want, and that the U.S. is the best country in the world, and that Israel is always only defending itself.
Oof.
I grew up and I live inside of the biggest empire in the world currently.
Yeah.
I've ingested all these myths about who we claim to be as an empire. And this quote, these set of quotes from Mahdi Sabbagh provides us with the beginning of an escape route from that indoctrination.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
So that's my application. What about you? What are you applying?
There's too much to react to there, but I love those questions. Like, how do we experience injustice? Why are they subjugated to injustice? Like, how is it funded? I mean, those are powerful questions that I think have so much applicability to a lot of the social ills that we're seeing across the board. That essay, that's one of my favorite ones. That was really good. My application comes from the foreword of this book, which again was written by Yasmin El-Rifai, as you mentioned earlier. She spoke of what we have learned and have continued to learn from Palestinians during this genocide. So she says this, quote, "But we learn from Palestinians, as we learn from struggling people throughout history, the irreplaceable value of the long horizon, the crucial role of the idea, of the narration of experience, of the direct questioning of domination, and of the creativity summoned in surviving that which we are not meant to survive. We learned that Zionism and other fascist nationalist projects operate psychologically beyond our biological timelines and depend on our thought being limited by them. They count on our exhaustion, on our despair, on our giving up. And so we must discipline and train our minds and our politics to see longer, to look farther, to look alongside those struggling and not simply at them." I love that last part in particular, to look alongside those struggling, not simply at them. I think that quote has it all and has so much transferability and applicability to our struggles across the board. And it serves as a powerful reminder of what we have to do in this struggle, whether we are the ones experiencing it firsthand or we are the ones, as she says there, that need to walk alongside those struggling. And I just thought that was such a powerful message to carry with us after, putting this book down and reflecting on it and thinking about what we're going to use it for. I think that message is what we can walk away from this book with.
Yeah. They count on our exhaustion, our despair, our giving up. We have to discipline and train our minds and our politics to see longer, look farther. Yeah, that's it. I think, and we've talked about that a few different times in a few different ways, that, so many things still exist because we only know that thing.
Yes.
And we're exhausted about thinking about something else.
Yep.
And we have to build the structures to support one another to be able to see beyond that and imagine new things.
Yeah.
And all of that. Right?
And one of the other things we talked about is how these movements in this work takes time, right?
Yeah.
It just takes time. Almost nothing changes overnight.
Yeah.
And so again, counting on that exhaustion, that despair, you have to organize for years for something to change. And that victory is sweet and it's amazing, but it also takes time.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's homework time.
Okay.
what do we want to do to continue learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? One of the organizations mentioned in the acknowledgments of this book is the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at Arizona State University, which I'd like to learn more about. The website for the center describes it as, quote, an indigenous space at ASU where we constellate stories, knowledges, and language across our many borderlands through strategic and exploratory modes of research, conversation, and performance. Essential to our understanding of indigeneity is a kinship with the land, a connection that moves beyond where we are or how we got here, and represents an evolving awareness and practice of relationality with land, water, and other human and non-human life. The imaginations shaped in this desert and in these bordered lands are capable of influencing and catalyzing the futures we believe we deserve. Wow. So that's such a great summary of who they are and what they do. And it looks like they have a lot of great research projects and initiatives that explore poetry and literature and all kinds of people who find themselves on the borders, on the margins of the U.S. empire. So I just want to do a little bit more digging and maybe read some of what they've created as a center and published, because it just seems incredible.
It really does.
Yeah. So, but how about you? What's your homework?
Yeah, I want to co-sign that. I hadn't looked into them, so I'm glad you found a little bit about what they talk about is their mission and their work and what they've done and what's important to them. And it sounds incredible. So I'll co-sign that. I think for homework, I want to check out more of Yasmin Al-Rifai's writings, right? There was so much that was profound about her insight in the forward in particular. And so I just want to read more of her stuff. She's been in a lot of publications. She's the co-producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature, which we mentioned earlier. So I'd love to just check out what else she's written and possibly even bring some of that to the table for us here. And I think related to that, it would also be good to check out the work from the other folks who wrote and contributed essays to this book, because I'm sure they've written other things. And again, I want to name at times the words, the content, everything was heady and heavy in here, and it was hard to get through, but it was important to get through. And I'm so glad that we did. So I wanted to see what else we can learn from the brilliant folks featured in this book.
Yeah, that's great homework. There's so many great essays and things we didn't even get a chance to talk about yet.
Yeah, right.
As always, when we read stuff. But when we read books, that's the way it goes.
That's the way it goes.
So, all right, well, that's it for this week's book. But Damien, you're up next time. So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Absolutely. So I'm going to bring a piece from the brand new edition of Hammer and Hope to the table for us to talk about. Their latest edition is their fourth release and was published just a few weeks ago this summer. So I'm excited to be able to bring the first piece from their summer 2024 issue to the table for us to talk about. So there's lots of great pieces in this. It's always so difficult to pick, right? But the piece I'm going to bring is called My Time Organizing on Campus Against Apartheid in South Africa. And it was written by the one and only Barbara Ransby, which is awesome. In this piece, she shares her experience as a young college organizer working towards and for really transnational solidarity and fighting racism, settler colonialism, and apartheid some 40 years ago, right? And I haven't read much of the piece at all yet, but I imagine, and given that it's Barbara Ransby, that it's going to be an incredible reflection of her time as a college organizer and how the lessons she and her comrades learned during that time applied to the myriad of organizing taking place not only on college campuses right now, but I think just more broadly than that around the country, around the world. So I'm excited to read this one and get a chance to talk about it with you next time.
Yeah, me too. I've been looking forward to trying to dig into some of that new issue of Hammer and Hope.
Yes.
And
it's time.
It's time.
Yes.
So looking forward to that conversation we have right here on mic next week.
Yes.
So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.